Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that might just make you question everything you thought you knew about the calm, collected figures of history. We're talking about the miserable lives of famous philosophers and more. You know, those brilliant minds whose ideas shaped civilizations, whose names echo through the halls of academia. But what if I told you that behind the grand theories and profound insights, many of these intellectual giants lived lives riddled with hardship, struggle, and often a surprising amount of personal torment? Imagine for a moment being born into a world where comfort was a luxury and intellectual pursuit often meant social ostracism or even worse. Think about the biting cold of a damp, unheated room as you meticulously scratch out groundbreaking ideas by candlelight, your stomach rumbling with hunger, or the constant threat of disease, the ever-present shadow of early death, as you try to make sense of existence. It's a far cry from the cozy armchair philosophy we might imagine today. You probably wouldn't survive a week in their shoes, let alone produce a magnum opus. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from tonight? What time is it for you? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together, exploring the surprising and often somber realities faced by those who dare to think deeply. Our journey begins not with a grand pronouncement, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible hum, like the distant whisper of a forgotten age. You find yourself drifting back, far back, to a time when the very concept of philosophy was just beginning to coalesce, when the first brave souls dared to question the world around them. And as you float through this nascent intellectual landscape, you begin to see that the path of the thinker was rarely smooth, rarely comfortable. In fact, for many, it was a brutal, arduous trek, paved with poverty, ridicule, and sometimes outright danger. Consider the ancient Greeks, often lauded as the cradle of Western thought. We picture toga-clad figures debating under sunny skies, but the reality was often far grittier. Take Thales of Miletus, often credited as the first philosopher. You might imagine him as a revered sage, dispensing wisdom from a comfortable stoop. But Thales, despite his brilliance in astronomy and mathematics, was said to have been ridiculed for his poverty. People questioned the value of philosophy if it didn't bring material wealth. One story, perhaps apocryphal but certainly illustrative, tells of how Thales, tired of the jibes, used his knowledge of meteorology to predict a bumper olive harvest. He then shrewdly bought up all the olive presses in Miletus, making a fortune when the harvest came, thereby proving that a philosopher could be practical, if they so chose. Yet, the underlying message remains for early philosophers. The pursuit of wisdom often came at the cost of worldly success, or at least the appearance of it. You can almost feel the sting of those dismissive remarks, the cold shoulder from those who valued coin over contemplation. Then there's Anaximander, another Milesian, who dared to propose that the Earth floated unsupported in space, a truly radical idea for his time. Imagine the intellectual courage required to posit such a theory when everyone else believed the world rested on something solid. This wasn't just a casual thought, it was a profound break from conventional wisdom. And such breaks rarely come without consequence. While history doesn't record him facing direct persecution, dissenting from established views often meant social marginalization, a subtle but persistent chill that could permeate every aspect of your life. You might find your ideas dismissed, your company avoided, your very sanity questioned. It's a quiet form of misery, perhaps, but one that can gnaw at the soul just as effectively as any physical hardship. As we move forward, the threads of hardship continue to weave themselves into the fabric of philosophical lives. Think of Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher, who famously declared that you cannot step into the same river twice. He was known for his solitary nature, his disdain for the common populace, and his cryptic pronouncements. Legend has it he preferred living in the mountains, eating grass and herbs, a self-imposed exile from what he saw as the foolishness of society. While some might view this as a choice, consider the implications of deliberate detachment from human connection, a profound sense of alienation from your peers. This kind of isolation, even if chosen, can be a heavy burden. The constant awareness of being an outsider and of seeing the world in a way few others do can be a lonely and often painful existence. You're always on the periphery, watching the world flow by, unable or unwilling to fully immerse yourself in its currents. And what about Empedocles? This pre-Socratic philosopher from Sicily was a fascinating figure, a poet, physician, and mystic who believed that all matter was composed of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. He claimed to be a god and was even said to have performed miracles. However, his life ended in a dramatic, almost theatrical fashion. The popular, though probably mythical, story is that he threw himself into the volcano Mount Etna to prove his divinity, or perhaps to simply disappear and leave no trace, thus cementing his legendary status. Whether true or not, the tale speaks to a certain instability, a desperation for ultimate understanding or recognition that pushed him to extreme lengths. The constant pressure to prove your theories, to gain acceptance for your often revolutionary ideas, could easily lead to such a desperate quest for validation, or a profound disillusionment when it didn't arrive. You can almost feel the heat of the volcano's breath, the pull of that final, desperate leap. The philosophical landscape was not just fraught with social and personal struggles, it was also a place where physical comfort was often a distant dream. Many early thinkers lived lives of austerity, either by choice or necessity. Access to books was limited, travel was arduous, and communication was slow. Imagine trying to develop complex arguments without the easy access to libraries or the instant communication we have today. Every idea had to be painstakingly developed, transcribed, and disseminated, often by hand. This intense intellectual labor, coupled with a lack of material comforts, could take a significant toll on both body and mind. You're hunched over parchment, perhaps by flickering lamplight, your eyes straining, your back aching, all for the sake of an idea that might not even be understood, let alone appreciated by your contemporaries. The constant intellectual debate itself, while stimulating, could also be a source of immense stress and anxiety. Imagine engaging in rigorous philosophical discussions where your every argument is scrutinized, picked apart, and challenged. This kind of intellectual sparring, while essential for the development of ideas, could also be emotionally draining. For every brilliant insight celebrated, there were likely dozens of frustrating dead ends, rejections, and misinterpretations. This relentless intellectual struggle, far from being a purely cerebral exercise, often felt like a full-contact sport, with reputations and livelihoods on the line. You're always on guard, always ready to defend your position, always aware that a single misstep could undermine years of work. One of the most persistent threads of misery woven through the lives of early philosophers was the constant threat of political instability and tyranny. Unlike today, where academic freedom is often, though not always, protected, thinkers in ancient times were often at the mercy of capricious rulers or volatile political climates. Speaking truth to power could, and often did, lead to exile, imprisonment, or even execution. The very act of questioning the status quo, of encouraging critical thought, was seen by many in power as a dangerous subversion. You might wake up one morning to find your patron has been overthrown, your school dissolved, or your own life in peril simply because your ideas, no matter how abstract, were perceived as a threat. Consider the case of Anaxagoras, a philosopher who brought philosophy from Ionia to Athens. He posited that the sun was a red-hot stone and the moon was made of earth, reflecting the sun's light. Revolutionary ideas for the time, but also dangerous. He was accused of impiety for denying the divinity of celestial bodies, a serious charge in deeply religious Athens. While he was ultimately exiled rather than executed, the threat was very real. He had to flee his home, leaving behind his life and work, simply for daring to offer a scientific explanation for phenomena that others attributed to the gods. Imagine packing your meager belongings, not knowing where you would go or if you would ever be safe again, all because you followed your intellect where it led. This constant precariousness, this ever-present possibility of exile or worse, must have been a profound source of anxiety, a gnawing worry that underpinned every intellectual pursuit. And let's not forget the sheer physical discomfort that was simply a fact of life for most people in the ancient world. Philosophers included. Basic sanitation was rudimentary at best. Disease was rampant, and access to medical care was primitive. You might be grappling with profound cosmic questions while simultaneously battling a persistent cough, a festering wound, or the gnawing ache of an untreated illness. The body was a constant reminder of mortality, a source of distraction from the lofty realms of thought. This omnipresent physical vulnerability, this lack of basic comforts, adds another layer to the miserable lives these thinkers often led. You're not just contemplating the nature of reality, you're also wondering if that persistent fever will finally claim you. The search for truth often meant challenging deeply ingrained beliefs, and this rarely made one popular. Think of the societal pressure, the subtle and not so subtle cues that tell you to conform, to believe what everyone else believes. For a philosopher, whose very vocation is to question, this pressure could be immense. It required a profound internal fortitude to stand firm in your convictions, even when those convictions made you an outcast. The weight of societal disapproval, the quiet judgment of your neighbors, could be a heavier burden than any physical privation. You're not just an individual with thoughts. You're often seen as a provocateur, a disruptor, someone who threatens the comfortable certainties of your community. Even finding patrons or students who genuinely understood and supported their work was a challenge for many philosophers. Imagine pouring your life's work into a theory, only to have it misinterpreted, trivialized, or simply ignored. The intellectual isolation could be profound, a deep sense of being alone in your pursuit of knowledge. While we often celebrate the lone genius, the reality of such solitude could be incredibly taxing. Who do you bounce ideas off of? Who provides constructive criticism? Who understands the nuances of your arguments? For many, the answer was, tragically, no one. This intellectual loneliness, this feeling of speaking into a void, could be one of the most insidious forms of misery. The constant need to secure a livelihood also plagued many philosophers. Unlike today, where a university position might offer a stable income, many ancient thinkers had to rely on teaching, patronage, or even manual labor to survive. This meant that the pursuit of truth was often intertwined with the mundane and often exhausting struggle for daily bread. You might be contemplating the nature of the cosmos by day and toiling in the fields or teaching grammar to uninterested youths by night. This duality of existence, the high-minded thought colliding with the harsh realities of survival, must have been a perpetual source of frustration and weariness. It's hard to achieve enlightenment when your stomach is growling. One particular historical fact that often goes unnoticed is the high infant mortality rate in ancient times. Many philosophers, like other people, would have experienced the heartbreaking loss of children. Imagine the profound grief, the immense sorrow that would have accompanied such losses. This personal tragedy, layered on top of all the other hardships, paints an even more somber picture of their lives. It's a stark reminder that even the most brilliant minds were not immune to the universal pains of human existence. The abstract beauty of their ideas often contrasted sharply with the very real and immediate sorrows of their personal lives. A lesser-known detail about the lives of some ancient philosophers is their tendency towards unconventional, sometimes even bizarre, personal habits. Take Diogenes of Sinope, the famous Cynic philosopher. He lived in a large ceramic jar or tub in the marketplace, embraced poverty, and openly challenged societal norms with audacious behavior. He famously carried a lamp in broad daylight, claiming to be searching for an honest man. While his radical lifestyle was a deliberate philosophical choice, aimed at demonstrating the absurdity of conventional life, it also meant a life of immense discomfort and social alienation. He was undoubtedly seen as a madman by many, living a life that few would envy, even if his ideas were profoundly influential. You might admire his conviction, but you probably wouldn't want to share his living space. The sheer lack of personal hygiene, the exposure to the elements, the constant scrutiny of the public, it all adds up to a life that, while perhaps intellectually liberating, was physically and socially miserable. The ongoing academic debate among historians often revolves around the extent to which these personal hardships truly shaped the philosophical output of these thinkers. Some historians argue that the very misery and struggle these philosophers endured fueled their profound insights and radical ideas. The suffering, they contend, wasn't just an unfortunate backdrop, but a crucial catalyst for their intellectual breakthroughs, forcing them to confront fundamental questions about existence, suffering, and the meaning of life. The crucible of hardship, in this view, forged the steel of their intellect. Conversely, other scholars suggest that these hardships were simply obstacles, hindrances that perhaps limited the full potential of these thinkers, or at least made their work far more arduous than it needed to be. They might argue that given more comfort and stability, these philosophers could have achieved even more, or perhaps developed different, less pessimistic philosophies. The struggle, they believe, was an unfortunate distraction, not a beneficial impetus. It's a fascinating chicken and egg question. Did their misery make them great? Or were they great despite their misery? The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in the middle. The profound connection between lived experience and intellectual output is undeniable. Yet disentangling cause and effect remains a complex and endlessly debated topic. You find yourself pondering, are the best ideas born from suffering? Or do they simply emerge from minds resilient enough to endure it? As we bring this first chapter to a close, you might feel a lingering sense of melancholy, a quiet understanding of the burdens carried by those who dared to illuminate the darkness with their minds. The echoes of their struggles, the whispers of their hardships, remind us that the pursuit of knowledge is rarely a sterile, purely intellectual endeavor. It is often a deeply human journey, fraught with personal pain, societal pressures, and the constant gnawing realities of existence. As your mind drifts gently onward, leaving the dim, dusty annals of the early philosophers, you find yourself drawn to a figure whose name is synonymous with wisdom itself, Socrates. You've likely heard of him, the archetypal philosopher, the man who knew that he knew nothing. But the life of Socrates, far from being a tranquil pursuit of truth, was a turbulent current, often pulling against the prevailing tides of Athenian society, eventually leading him to a bitter end. Imagine bustling Athens, a vibrant city-state, the birthplace of democracy, a place where ideas were debated fiercely in the agora, the marketplace, and there, amidst the merchants, politicians, and ordinary citizens. You see Socrates. He wasn't some cloistered academic or a wealthy aristocrat. He was, by all accounts, a man of humble origins, known for his unkempt appearance, his snub nose, and his intense, penetrating gaze. He wore simple clothes, often went barefoot, and seemed indifferent to material possessions. You might easily walk past him without a second glance, mistaking him for just another eccentric local. Yet his mind was a forge, constantly hammering out questions, challenging assumptions, and seeking the core of what it meant to live a good life. His method, the famous Socratic method, involved engaging people in conversation, asking a series of probing questions that would gradually expose contradictions in their beliefs, leading them to admit their own ignorance. While this sounds like a noble pursuit, imagine being on the receiving end. You, a respected craftsman, a proud politician, or an esteemed poet, are confident in your knowledge, only to have a seemingly simple man dismantle your certainties, piece by painful piece, in front of an audience. It wasn't exactly a recipe for popularity. you'd probably find it intensely irritating, maybe even humiliating, to have your deeply held convictions picked apart by a persistent, seemingly uneducated old man. Socrates was like a persistent gadfly, buzzing around the Athenian establishment, stinging them into self-reflection, whether they wanted it or not. And let's be honest, nobody likes a gadfly, no matter how insightful its sting. This relentless questioning, while intellectually invigorating for some, was deeply unsettling for many others, particularly those in positions of power or influence. Socrates challenged the very foundations of Athenian society, its conventional morality, its political leaders, even its gods. He wasn't teaching a fixed doctrine, he was teaching people how to think, how to question. And in a society where stability and tradition were highly valued, such radical intellectual freedom was seen as a dangerous, destabilizing force. You can almost feel the tension in the air as he interrogates a prominent figure, the murmurs of the crowd, the uncomfortable shifting of feet. It's not just a philosophical discussion, it's a public performance of intellectual dismantling. One of the most profound aspects of Socrates' miserable life was his poverty. He took no payment for his teaching, unlike the sophists, who charged hefty fees. This meant he relied on the generosity of friends and admirers, or simply lived a life of extreme frugality. Imagine trying to support a family. He had a wife, Xanthippe, and 3 sons with no stable income, constantly dependent on others. Xanthippe is famously portrayed as a shrew, often depicted as nagging and ill-tempered. But consider her perspective. She was married to a man who prioritized abstract philosophical debate over providing for his family. You can almost hear her exasperated sighs, the clatter of pots and pans, as she tries to make ends meet while her husband is out discussing virtue. It was a life of material hardship, a constant struggle against the practical realities of daily existence. It's hard to focus on the good, the true, and the beautiful when you're worried about where the next meal is coming from. Moreover, Socrates' physical appearance and personal habits were far from the idealized image of a Greek hero. He was often described as ugly, with bulging eyes and thick lips, resembling a satyr. He wore the same old cloak year-round, even in winter, and was known for his incredible endurance, able to stand still in contemplation for hours on end, even in the snow. While this demonstrated his philosophical discipline, it also set him apart, making him seem odd, perhaps even unhinged. To many of his contemporaries, you might appreciate his intellectual rigor, but you probably wouldn't invite him to your next dinner party without a strong suggestion for a change of clothes. This deliberate rejection of societal norms, while a testament to his character, also contributed to his isolation and the public's perception of him as an outsider. The culmination of Socrates' challenging life came with his famous trial in 399 BCE. He was accused of 2 main charges, impiety Sabea, for not believing in the gods of the state and introducing new divinities, and corrupting the youth of Athens. These charges were, in many ways, a proxy for the resentment and fear he had stirred up among the powerful elites. Some of his former students, like Alcibiades and Critias, had turned out to be disastrous figures for Athens, leading to political instability and tyranny. While Socrates himself disavowed their actions, the association was enough to taint his reputation. You can imagine the fear and anger in a city that had recently suffered a devastating defeat in the Peloponnesian War and endured the brutal rule of the 30 tyrants. They were looking for scapegoats. And Socrates, with his unsettling questions and unconventional ways, was an easy target. The trial itself was a travesty of justice by modern standards. Socrates, instead of pleading for mercy, used the opportunity to deliver a defense that was less about acquittal and more about upholding his philosophical principles. He famously declared that he was a gift from the gods to Athens, a gadfly meant to stir the city from its intellectual slumber. He even suggested, as an alternative punishment, that he should be honored with free meals at the Prytaneum, a privilege usually reserved for Olympic victors. This defiant stance, while admirable from a philosophical perspective, undoubtedly further enraged his accusers in the jury. You can almost hear the gasps of indignation, the rustling of cloaks, as he turns the tables on his accusers, challenging their very right to judge him. It was a magnificent display of intellectual courage, but it sealed his fate. Ultimately, Socrates was found guilty by a narrow margin. When given the opportunity to propose his own punishment, he again refused to compromise, leading the jury to sentence him to death by drinking hemlock. Imagine receiving that verdict, a death sentence for daring to think and teach. You might feel a cold knot in your stomach, the sudden chill of absolute finality. This wasn't just a legal outcome, it was a societal rejection of the very essence of his life's work. His final days in prison, chronicled beautifully by his student Plato in dialogues like Crito and Phaedo, were a testament to his unwavering commitment to his principles. Even facing imminent death, he continued to engage in philosophical discussion, debating the immortality of the soul with his grieving friends. His friends even offered him a chance to escape, to flee Athens and live in exile. But Socrates refused, arguing that to defy the laws of Athens, even unjust ones, would be to undermine the very principles of justice he had upheld throughout his life. He believed in the social contract, that having lived under Athens' laws, he was obligated to obey their verdicts, however flawed. This unwavering commitment to justice, even at the cost of his own life, is perhaps the most profound and painful aspect of his misery. He chose principle over self-preservation. The moment of his death, described by Plato, is both poignant and terrifying. As the hemlock slowly paralyzed his body, he remained composed, conversing with his friends until the very end. His last words, famously, were to Crito. Crito, we ought to offer a cock to Asclepius. Pay it, therefore, and do not neglect it. Asclepius was the god of healing, and this could be interpreted as Socrates viewing death as a cure for the ills of life, or perhaps a simple gesture of piety. You can almost feel the chill creeping up his limbs, the fading light in his eyes, the heavy silence that descends upon his weeping companions. It's a stark, brutal end to a life dedicated to illumination. Socrates' life, then, was a long, slow burn of intellectual intensity that ignited the flames of resentment and fear, ultimately consuming him. He was poor, physically unremarkable, socially abrasive, and politically dangerous in the eyes of the establishment. His misery wasn't just a matter of external circumstances. It was woven into the very fabric of his being, a consequence of his relentless pursuit of truth and his refusal to compromise. He was a man who deliberately made himself uncomfortable, and in doing so, made everyone else uncomfortable too. A common historical understanding is that Socrates willingly embraced his fate, viewing his death as a final philosophical act, a testament to his integrity and his belief in the rule of law, even when that law was unjust. He chose to die rather than abandon his principles or flee his city. This perspective emphasizes his profound moral courage and frames his execution not as a tragedy, but as a triumph of philosophical conviction. You might see him as a martyr, a beacon of intellectual freedom, sacrificing himself for the sake of truth. However, a lesser-known detail, often debated by scholars, is the extent to which Socrates might have been deliberately provoking his accusers and the jury. Some interpretations suggest that he wasn't simply defending himself, but actively seeking to expose the flaws and hypocrisies of the Athenian legal system and the democratic process itself. By refusing to grovel, by offering audacious counterproposals, and by maintaining his defiant philosophical stance, he may have intentionally pushed the jury towards the death penalty, knowing that his execution would immortalize his ideas and expose the moral bankruptcy of his accusers. This perspective paints him as a master strategist, using his trial as a final, dramatic lesson, albeit one that cost him his life. It raises the uncomfortable question, did he orchestrate his own demise to send a more powerful message? You can almost hear the whispers among his contemporaries. Did he want to die? The academic debate continues fiercely on the precise motivations behind Socrates' behavior during the trial. Some historians maintain that his actions were purely a result of his unyielding commitment to truth and justice, a testament to his integrity above all else. They argue that to suggest he deliberately sought death diminishes the tragic nature of his execution and misrepresents his sincere belief in the Athenian legal system. Despite its flaws, his actions in this view were a direct consequence of his philosophical principles, not a calculated political maneuver. On the other hand, a growing number of scholars propose that Socrates, being a keen observer of human nature and Athenian politics, must have understood the likely outcome of his defiant posture, and may have, in fact, welcomed it as a means to solidify his legacy and highlight the injustices of the state. They point to his consistent provocations and his calm acceptance of the verdict as evidence of a man who was prepared to die for his ideals, and perhaps even saw it as the ultimate philosophical statement. It's an intriguing question that makes you wonder about the layers of intention behind every great historical act. Was it pure principle, or a masterful game of intellectual chess? As the shadows lengthen and the image of ancient Athens begins to fade, you are left with the profound, perhaps unsettling legacy of Socrates. His life was a testament to the power of relentless questioning, but also a stark reminder of the often brutal consequences that can befall those who dare to challenge the comfortable certainties of their time. He lived a life of deliberate discomfort and eventually met a bitter end, yet his ideas blossomed in the aftermath, forever shaping the landscape of Western thought. The hemlock may have silenced his voice, but it amplified his message, turning his personal misery into an enduring beacon of philosophical courage. As the bitter taste of hemlock fades from your imagined palate, your journey through the tumultuous lives of great thinkers leads you inevitably to Plato, the prodigious student who immortalized Socrates and, in doing so, forged his own monumental philosophical legacy. While often seen as the foundational figure of Western philosophy, the architect of the ideal forms, and the philosopher king, Plato's life was far from a serene contemplation in an ivory tower. Instead, it was a complex tapestry woven with political disillusionment, personal risks, and the Sisyphean struggle to implement his lofty ideals in a flawed, messy world. Imagine yourself in ancient Athens again, but this time, the air feels different. The execution of Socrates has cast a long, dark shadow over the city, particularly for his devoted followers. You see Plato, a young aristocrat, once brimming with political ambition, now utterly disillusioned by the democratic system that condemned his beloved mentor. This profound trauma, this public murder of the wisest man he knew, reshaped the entire trajectory of his life. You can almost feel the sting of betrayal, the deep sense of injustice that would forever color his view of human governance. It's a wound that never truly heals, a constant reminder of the fragility of justice and the corruptibility of power. Born into a prominent Athenian aristocratic family, Plato had every advantage: wealth, status, and a superb education. He was even a talented wrestler and perhaps a poet in his youth. Yet, the political turmoil of his time, culminating in Socrates' death, convinced him that conventional politics was a dirty game, incapable of achieving true justice. This realization wasn't a gentle awakening. It was a harsh, gut-wrenching blow. He saw firsthand how the pursuit of power could pervert the pursuit of truth. This disillusionment was a significant source of personal misery, a constant ache of what could be against what was. You might have dreamed of a brilliant political career only to see the system you hoped to join devour the very virtues you admired. Plato's intellectual response to this disillusionment was the development of his theory of forms, or ideas. He posited that the world we perceive with our senses is merely a shadow of a higher, perfect, and unchanging reality. For him, concepts like beauty, justice, and goodness existed as perfect. Eternal forms in a realm accessible only through reason, not sensory experience. The famous allegory of the cave vividly illustrates this imagined prisoners chained in a cave, only ever seeing shadows cast by a fire, believing these shadows to be reality. Only when one breaks free and sees the sun does he grasp true reality, and then, upon returning to tell the others, is met with disbelief and hostility. This allegory wasn't just a philosophical puzzle, it was a deeply personal reflection on the difficulty and danger of pursuing truth in a world that preferred comforting illusions. You can feel the frustration of the liberated prisoner, the futility of trying to explain light to those who have only known shadows. Establishing the academy in Athens around 387 BCE, often considered the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, was a monumental undertaking for Plato. This wasn't just a school, it was a sanctuary for intellectual pursuit, a place where future philosopher kings might be trained. Yet, even this grand endeavor would have come with its own set of practical challenges: securing funding, attracting students, managing the daily logistics of a complex institution. It was a lifelong commitment, demanding immense dedication and resources. The image of the serene philosopher quietly contemplating truths often obscures the very real, often tedious, work involved in building and maintaining such a center of learning. You might picture grand lectures, but the reality was probably closer to managing a small, demanding community. With all its internal squabbles and external pressures, perhaps the most striking example of Plato's personal misery and persistent struggle was his repeated, ill-fated attempts to put his philosophical ideals into political practice. He made 3 journeys to Syracuse in Sicily, hoping to advise and educate its tyrannical rulers. Dionysius I and later Dionysius II, transforming them into his idealized philosopher kings. These expeditions were absolute disasters, fraught with danger and humiliation. On his first trip, summoned by Dionysius I's brother-in-law, Dion, Plato attempted to educate the tyrant. Dionysius, however, proved to be an unreceptive student, more interested in maintaining his power than in philosophical enlightenment. The story goes that Dionysius became so annoyed with Plato's bluntness and philosophical lectures that he had Plato imprisoned and even sold into slavery, though he was eventually ransomed by a friend. Imagine the utter shock and degradation: a renowned philosopher, a member of Athens' elite, suddenly reduced to a slave, traded like property. You can almost feel the chains, the cold, hard deck of the ship, the terrifying uncertainty of your fate. This wasn't just a political setback, it was a profound personal humiliation, a stark reminder of the brutal realities of power. Despite this traumatic experience, Plato returned to Syracuse twice more. Driven by an unshakable belief in his political philosophy and urged by Dion, his second trip to advise the younger Dionysius II was equally disappointing. While initially more receptive, Dionysius II proved to be fickle and suspicious, eventually exiling Dion and again treating Plato with disrespect, effectively keeping him under house arrest. The third trip was an attempt to mediate a reconciliation between Dion and Dionysius II, but it too ended in failure and great personal risk for Plato, who barely escaped with his life. Dion himself was later assassinated. These repeated failures and near-fatal encounters must have been an immense source of despair for Plato. He dedicated years of his life, risked his freedom and even his life, all in the service of an ideal that ultimately proved unattainable. The dream of the philosopher king, so beautifully articulated in his Republic, crashed against the harsh rocks of political reality. You can sense the crushing weight of disappointment, the bitter taste of unrealized ambition, the gnawing question of whether his grand theories were simply pipe dreams. It's the agony of seeing your most cherished beliefs fail spectacularly in the real world. The philosopher's life was also marked by a certain intellectual loneliness. Despite having many students, Plato's radical ideas, particularly his theory of forms and his ideal state, were highly abstract and often challenged by his own contemporaries and even his most brilliant student, Aristotle. While robust debate is the hallmark of philosophy, the constant intellectual sparring, The need to continually defend and refine complex theories could be intellectually taxing. There were no easy answers, no universally accepted truths, and the path to knowledge was often a solitary one. You might find yourself surrounded by students, but profoundly alone in the depths of your own thought. Beyond the political and intellectual struggles, Plato, like any human, would have faced personal losses and the inevitable decline of old age. While specific details of his private life are sparse, the passage of time brings its own forms of misery. The loss of friends, the waning of physical strength, the growing awareness of one's own mortality. His long life he lived to around 80 years old meant witnessing many changes, some undoubtedly painful. In the world he sought to shape, the weight of years, the accumulation of disappointments, must have settled upon him, even as his mind remained sharp. A popular historical anecdote, though likely apocryphal, highlights a lighter, yet still illustrative, aspect of Plato's human struggles. It's said that while teaching about the ideal form of man as a featherless biped, Diogenes the Cynic, remember him from the tub, supposedly brought a plucked chicken into Plato's academy, declaring, "Behold Plato's man." This public mockery, even if apocryphal, illustrates the kind of intellectual ridicule and challenge that Plato, despite his stature, would have faced. You can almost hear the snickers of the students, the awkward silence as Plato tries to maintain his composure. It's a reminder that even the most profound thinkers are not immune to being made fun of. A lesser-known detail about Plato's later life concerns his increasing fascination with mathematics and astronomy, which became central to his understanding of the cosmos and the ideal state. His later dialogues, like Timaeus and Laws, delve deeply into cosmology and political theory, often with a more practical, though still idealistic, bent. This shift might be interpreted as a pragmatic response to his earlier political failures, a realization that perhaps the ideal state could only be achieved through a deeper understanding of the underlying mathematical order of the universe, rather than through direct political intervention. It suggests a subtle but significant evolution in his approach, perhaps a mellowing of his earlier, more fervent political ambitions in favor of a more abstract, cosmic vision. The academic debate surrounding Plato often centers on the tension between his idealistic philosophy and his practical political failures. Some historians argue that Plato's repeated attempts to implement his theories in Syracuse were a testament to his profound commitment to applying philosophy to real-world problems, even if they resulted in personal suffering and political disaster. They see these failures not as weaknesses, but as noble, if ultimately tragic, efforts to bridge the gap between theory and practice, demonstrating his belief that philosophy must engage with the world, not simply retreat from it. His misery, in this view, was a consequence of his courageous idealism. Conversely, other scholars suggest that Plato's political forays were a naive, perhaps even arrogant, overestimation of philosophy's power to transform human nature and political reality. They contend that his repeated failures highlight the inherent dangers of imposing abstract ideals onto complex societies, and that his suffering was a self-inflicted wound, a result of his inability to temper his idealism with pragmatic political understanding. They might argue that he failed to learn from his own experiences, returning to Syracuse despite clear warnings. It's a fascinating discussion that touches on the perennial question of whether philosophers should be kings or simply advisors. As your mind gently drifts from the sun-drenched, yet politically turbulent, landscapes of ancient Sicily and Athens, you carry with you the complex image of Plato. He was a philosopher of soaring ideals, but also a man profoundly acquainted with disappointment, danger, and the bitter taste of failure. His life reminds us that even the most brilliant minds are not immune to the miseries of human existence, and that the pursuit of a perfect world often comes at a steep personal cost. Yet, it was through these struggles that his ideas were forged, leaving an indelible mark on the intellectual bedrock of civilization, urging us to look beyond the shadows and seek the forms of truth, beauty, and justice, even if the path to them is paved with personal sorrow. As the grand, yet often troubled, visions of Plato's idealism recede, your intellectual journey now brings you to his most brilliant student and, in many ways, his greatest intellectual rival, Aristotle. Often hailed as the master of those who know by Dante, Aristotle's mind was a vast landscape, categorizing, analyzing, and explaining nearly every field of knowledge known to the ancient world, from biology and ethics to logic and metaphysics. Yet, beneath this monumental intellectual edifice lay a life marked by significant personal upheavals, political complexities, and the constant struggle to reconcile theoretical brilliance with the messy realities of empirical observation. Imagine yourself in Stagira, a small Greek city, where Aristotle was born in 384 BCE. His father was the personal physician to King Amyntas III of Macedon, which gave Aristotle a unique connection to the Macedonian court from a young age. This early exposure to both scientific inquiry through his father's medical profession and political power would shape his worldview in profound ways. When he was about 17, he traveled to Athens and joined Plato's academy, where he remained for nearly 2 decades until Plato's death. This period must have been intellectually exhilarating, but also perhaps intensely challenging. Imagine being the brightest student of a towering genius, constantly trying to both absorb and critically evaluate the master's profound, yet sometimes abstract, teachings. You can almost feel the intellectual ferment, the late-night debates, the constant push and pull between the idealistic and the empirical. Upon Plato's death, Aristotle was passed over for the leadership of the academy, likely due to his growing philosophical divergence from Plato's core tenets, particularly his rejection of the theory of forms. This must have been a significant personal disappointment, a subtle but sharp sting of rejection from the institution where he had spent so much of his formative years. You might have envisioned yourself leading the very place you had dedicated 2 decades to, only to be deemed too different, too independent. This professional setback spurred him to leave Athens. His next phase of life involved a period of travel and research. He spent time in Assos and Mytilene, conducting extensive biological research, particularly on marine life. This wasn't a leisurely academic sabbatical. Imagine collecting specimens, dissecting animals, meticulously observing the natural world without the aid of modern instruments, all while likely living in relatively rustic conditions. This hands-on empirical approach was a stark contrast to Plato's more abstract mathematical focus, showcasing Aristotle's unique scientific bent. You can almost smell the salt air, feel the dampness of the rocks, as he patiently examines a creature of the sea, driven by an insatiable curiosity about the tangible world. However, one of the most significant and potentially precarious periods of Aristotle's life came when he was invited by King Philip II of Macedon to tutor his young son, Alexander the Great, in 343 BCE. Imagine the immense responsibility and political tightrope walk involved in educating the future ruler of the known world. While this was a position of immense prestige, it also placed Aristotle squarely in the orbit of a powerful, volatile, and ambitious monarchy. You were directly influencing a child who would one day command armies and conquer empires. The pressure must have been immense. The relationship between Aristotle and Alexander is a subject of much historical fascination and debate. While Aristotle instilled in Alexander a love for Greek culture, literature, especially Homer, and perhaps a basic understanding of philosophy and science, it's clear that their paths diverged dramatically once Alexander ascended to power. Alexander's ambition grew boundless, leading him to conquer vast empires, a goal that many believe conflicted with Aristotle's ideal of the self-sufficient Greek city-state. Aristotle certainly wouldn't have condoned Alexander's increasingly autocratic rule or his adoption of Persian customs. This growing ideological chasm between mentor and student, especially one who became the most powerful man in the world, must have been a source of quiet dismay and potential danger for Aristotle. You taught him, but he chose a path you could not endorse. This philosophical disappointment, seeing your teachings seemingly ignored by your most famous pupil, could be a profound source of intellectual and personal misery. After Alexander ascended to the throne, Aristotle returned to Athens in 335 BCE and founded his own school, the Lyceum, also known as the Peripatetic School because he taught while walking Peripatos. This was another massive undertaking, mirroring Plato's Academy but with a distinct emphasis on empirical observation, classification, and logical reasoning. The Lyceum housed a vast library and a collection of specimens, indicating a sophisticated research institution. But establishing and maintaining such a school, attracting students, and managing its operations would have demanded immense practical effort alongside his prolific intellectual output. He was not just a thinker, he was an administrator, a curator, and a manager of a complex academic enterprise. Yet, his connection to the Macedonian court, once a source of prestige, became a dangerous liability. When Alexander the Great died suddenly in 323 BCE, Athens, which had long resented Macedonian dominance, erupted in an anti-Macedonian backlash. Aristotle, as Alexander's former tutor and a known associate of the Macedonian regime, immediately became a target. He was accused of impiety, the very charge that led to Socrates' execution, though the specific allegations against him are less clear than those against Socrates. It was a trumped-up charge, a convenient way for the Athenians to target a prominent figure associated with their former oppressors. You can almost feel the shift in the political winds, the sudden palpable danger as public sentiment turns against you. Aristotle, as remembering Socrates' fate, chose a different path. He famously stated, "I will not allow the Athenians to sin twice against philosophy," and fled Athens, seeking refuge in Chalcis on the island of Euboea, his mother's ancestral home. This forced exile, abandoning his beloved Lyceum and his life's work in Athens, must have been a profound personal blow, a bitter ending to decades of intellectual labor in the city. Imagine having to leave everything behind: the fear of capture, the uncertainty of exile, all because of political tides beyond your control. It's a cruel twist of fate for a man who championed logic and order, to be caught in the irrational currents of public anger. He died in Chalcis just a year later, in 322 BCE, at the age of 62 or 63, likely from a stomach ailment. His exile was short, but it marked a tragic end to an otherwise incredibly productive life. The circumstances of his death, far from the intellectual centers he had created, underscore the precariousness of even the most brilliant lives in times of political turmoil. His death, away from the intellectual heart of Greece, was a quiet, almost unremarked end for a man whose mind encompassed so much. Beyond these major external events, Aristotle's life, like any human's, would have been marked by personal struggles and relationships. He was married to Pythias, the niece of his friend Hermias of Atarnus, a ruler who was later executed by the Persians, another potentially traumatic event for Aristotle. They had a daughter, also named Pythias. After his wife's death, he formed a relationship with Herpyllis, with whom he had a son, Nicomachus, to whom his famous Nicomachean Ethics is dedicated. The complexities of family life, the joys and sorrows of relationships, would have added to the fabric of his experiences. While his works rarely delve into his personal feelings, the universal human experience of love, loss, and familial responsibility would have been present. The sheer volume and breadth of Aristotle's work also suggest a life of relentless intellectual labor. He reportedly wrote over 200 treatises, though only about 31 have survived, mostly as lecture notes or drafts. Imagine the immense dedication required to produce such an encyclopedic body of knowledge without modern research tools. It was a life largely spent in study, observation, and writing, a monumental task that would have consumed most of his waking hours. This intellectual rigor, while exhilarating, could also be isolating and physically draining. You're constantly pushing the boundaries of what's known, meticulously categorizing every bit of information, and the sheer mental effort must have been exhausting. A general historical fact about Aristotle often highlighted is his role in laying the foundation for inductive reasoning and the scientific method. While Plato emphasized deductive reasoning from first principles, Aristotle championed observation and experience as the starting point for knowledge. He meticulously categorized animals, plants, and forms of government, building systems of thought based on empirical data. This fundamental shift in approach, away from pure abstraction and towards grounded observation, revolutionized how knowledge was pursued and transmitted, earning him the title of the first true scientist. You can almost see him with a magnifying glass, examining the intricate details of a specimen, patiently documenting every feature. A peculiar, lesser-known detail about Aristotle's personal life is his will, which survived and offers a rare glimpse into his domestic arrangements and personal values. In it, he makes detailed provisions for his family, slaves, and burial. He requested that his bones be laid next to those of his deceased wife, Pythias, showing a deep affection for her. He also explicitly provided for the care of his slaves, requesting that they be freed when they reached a certain age and not be sold, which was a somewhat progressive stance for his time, though still within the framework of ancient slavery. This unusual document reveals a man concerned with justice and compassion in his personal realm, contrasting with the often harsh political realities he navigated. It makes you wonder about the private struggles he endured, the personal attachments that anchored him amidst intellectual and political storms. The ongoing academic debate concerning Aristotle often revolves around the extent of his influence on later thought, and whether his emphasis on observation truly diverged from Plato's idealism as much as traditionally believed. Some historians argue that Aristotle's empirical method fundamentally broke with Plato's transcendental philosophy, laying the groundwork for scientific inquiry and a more grounded approach to knowledge. They see him as the father of science, a pragmatic counterpoint to Plato's otherworldly focus. His misery, in this view, was the product of living through the difficult birth of a new intellectual paradigm. Conversely, other scholars propose that Aristotle, while empirical, still retained significant Platonic influences, particularly in his teleological view of nature, the idea that things have inherent purposes or ends. They argue that his philosophy was more of a sophisticated refinement of Plato's ideas rather than a complete repudiation, and that the break between them is often overstated. This debate highlights the complex, intertwined nature of philosophical lineage. How much does a student truly depart from their master? And how much do they build upon and implicitly retain what they've learned? As you gently drift from the complexities of ancient Greece, the intellectual titan that was Aristotle lingers in your mind. His life, while less dramatically tragic than Socrates, was nonetheless marked by professional disappointments, political dangers, and the immense solitary burden of building an intellectual empire from the ground up. He experienced the highs of royal patronage and the lows of forced exile, forever grappling with the chasm between abstract thought and concrete reality. His journey reminds us that even the most encyclopedic minds are subject to the caprices of fate and the personal costs of profound intellectual endeavor. As the echoes of Aristotle's empirical classifications fade, your journey through the landscapes of philosophical struggle now carries you across centuries, from the sun-drenched Mediterranean to the colder climes of 17th century Europe, to encounter René Descartes, often hailed as the father of modern philosophy and analytical geometry, the man who famously declared cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Descartes' life was a restless odyssey marked by constant movement. Profound intellectual solitude, metaphor, and the persistent gnawing doubt that fueled his revolutionary thought. Imagine yourself in a chilly, dimly lit room in a quiet corner of the Netherlands, far from the bustling intellectual centers of his native France. This is where Descartes spent much of his productive life, seeking the tranquility and isolation necessary for his radical philosophical and mathematical inquiries. He was born in La Haye-en-Touraine, France in 1596 to a family of minor nobility. His early education at the Jesuit Collège Royal Henri le Grand at La Flèche exposed him to the prevailing scholastic philosophy, which he would later vehemently reject as uncertain and foundational. This early disillusionment with the established academic wisdom of his time was a nascent seed of his intellectual misery, a feeling that the very bedrock of knowledge was shaky. You can imagine a young, brilliant mind poring over ancient texts, only to find them filled with contradictions and unsupported assertions. It's a frustrating realization, a sense of intellectual homelessness. Descartes was a delicate child, prone to illness, and was often allowed to lie in bed late in the mornings, a habit he maintained throughout his life, claiming it was conducive to philosophical meditation. While perhaps a luxury, this physical frailty and the need for prolonged periods of rest highlight a more subtle form of discomfort. He wasn't robust. His body, perhaps Newark, was a constant reminder of limitation, even as his mind soared. This need for specific, controlled environments for his work hints at a certain fragility, a deliberate carving out of mental space away from the world's clamor. After studying law and then serving as a mercenary soldier for various European armies during the 30 Years' War, Descartes found his true calling. His military service wasn't a philosophical retreat. It was a rough, often brutal immersion in the practicalities of the world. Imagine the stark contrast between the chaos of battlefields and the quiet introspection he craved. It was during this period, particularly on a cold November night in 1619, while stationed in a stove-heated room in Ulm, Germany, that he experienced a series of vivid dreams or visions that he interpreted as a divine revelation, a call to establish a new scientific and philosophical method based on mathematical certainty. This moment of revelation, though transformative, also placed a monumental burden on him. The immense task of rebuilding all knowledge from the ground up. You can almost feel the chill of the winter night, the heat of the stove, and the sudden, overwhelming rush of an idea that would consume his life. Descartes was obsessed with finding absolute certainty, a foundation upon which all knowledge could be securely built, much like the axioms in mathematics. He rejected sensory experience as unreliable and argued for the primacy of reason. His method involved systematic doubt, questioning everything until he arrived at an undeniable truth. This relentless self-questioning, this methodological skepticism, while intellectually powerful, must have been a profoundly isolating and mentally taxing process. Imagine constantly doubting your own perceptions, your own thoughts, even your own existence. It's a lonely battle against the very fabric of reality, a continuous mental wrestling match. To pursue his intellectual work with minimal distraction and avoid the scrutiny of both religious and academic authorities, who were often hostile to new ideas that challenged scholasticism, Descartes chose a life of constant relocation and deliberate isolation. He moved to the Netherlands in 1628, where he lived in various cities and quiet country houses for over 20 years, changing addresses frequently to maintain his privacy. This self-imposed exile, while providing intellectual freedom, meant a life largely devoid of deep personal connections and the comforts of a fixed home or a supportive intellectual community. You're always the outsider, the stranger, constantly adapting to new surroundings, guarding your thoughts from potential critics. This rootlessness, this deliberate emotional detachment, could be a profound source of quiet misery, a subtle but persistent ache of loneliness. His professional life was also marked by controversies and criticisms. His revolutionary ideas, particularly his mechanistic view of the universe and his mind-body dualism, often put him at odds with the powerful Catholic Church and conservative academics. His book Discourse on Method 1637 and Meditations on First Philosophy 1641 were groundbreaking, but also drew intense scrutiny. His scientific work, like his Le Monde the World, which posited a heliocentric universe, was withheld from publication after Galileo's condemnation by the Inquisition. In 1633, a clear warning about the dangers of challenging orthodoxy. This constant fear of persecution, the need to self-censor or publish anonymously, must have been a heavy burden. You're a brilliant mind, full of groundbreaking ideas, but you must constantly look over your shoulder, fearing that your next thought could lead to your undoing. Descartes also experienced profound personal tragedy. He had an illegitimate daughter, Francine, with a servant named Helena Jans van der Stroom. He adored Francine and even had plans to bring her to France for her education, suggesting a deep paternal affection. However, Francine tragically died of scarlet fever at the age of 5 in 1640. Imagine the heartbreak, the immense grief of losing a child, especially a beloved only child in a time when childhood mortality was devastatingly common. This personal loss, hidden beneath his public persona as a detached rationalist, must have been an immense source of private misery, a wound that likely never fully healed. You can almost feel the cold silence of the empty nursery, the lingering scent of a child who is no more. It's a stark reminder that even the most formidable intellects are not immune to the rawest forms of human suffering. His intellectual exchanges, though vital, often involved intense and sometimes bitter debates. His correspondence with Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, while philosophically enriching, also highlighted the difficulties in explaining his complex dualism, particularly how an immaterial mind could interact with a material body. These ongoing conceptual struggles, the constant need to clarify and defend his most fundamental ideas, were themselves a form of intellectual labor that could be frustrating and draining. You're trying to explain the universe, but you can't even perfectly articulate how a thought translates into a movement of your hand. The final, perhaps most poignant, misery of Descartes' life came when he accepted an invitation from Queen Christina of Sweden to tutor her in philosophy. While a great honor, it proved to be a fatal decision. Christina was a demanding student, insisting on lessons at 5:00 a.m. in her unheated library during the harsh Swedish winter. Descartes, accustomed to his warm bed and late mornings, found the rigorous schedule and the freezing temperatures debilitating. He contracted pneumonia and died in February 1650, just a few months after arriving in Stockholm. Imagine fleeing the intellectual and political pressures of your homeland for decades, meticulously crafting a life of quiet contemplation, only to succumb to the demands of a royal patron in a foreign land. His death was a cruel irony, a life dedicated to the mind brought to an end by the frailties of the body and the rigors of an uncongenial environment. A commonly cited historical fact about Descartes is his profound influence on the development of modern science and philosophy, particularly through his emphasis on rationalism and his creation of analytic geometry, which unified algebra and geometry and was crucial for the development of calculus. His quest for certainty, even if his specific solutions are now debated, set the stage for the Enlightenment and continues to shape philosophical inquiry to this day. You can trace a direct line from his methodical doubt to the scientific method's emphasis on verifiable evidence. A lesser-known detail about Descartes is his keen interest in medicine and physiology. He believed that through a deeper understanding of the human body, one could potentially extend life and overcome disease. He conducted dissections and experiments, even trying to explain the mechanics of the body as a complex machine. This interest was not purely academic. It stemmed from a very human desire to overcome the physical limitations and suffering that he himself experienced, and perhaps most poignantly, the suffering he witnessed in the loss of his daughter. It adds a layer of practical concern to the abstract philosopher, revealing a man deeply affected by the physical realities of existence. The academic debate concerning Descartes often centers on the lingering problems of his mind-body dualism. Some historians and philosophers argue that while his dualism provided a powerful framework for understanding consciousness and the physical world separately, it created an intractable interaction problem. How can an immaterial mind affect a material body? And vice versa. They see this as a fundamental flaw that subsequent philosophy has struggled to resolve. leading to ongoing philosophical misery. In a sense, like as thinkers try to bridge the chasm he created. Conversely, other scholars defend Descartes, arguing that his dualism was a necessary step in distinguishing between the subjective realm of consciousness and the objective realm of physical science, thereby allowing for the independent development of both psychology and physics. They contend that the problem of interaction is perhaps not a flaw in his concept, but a challenge for future scientific and philosophical inquiry. And what? A testament to the depth of his insights rather than their limitation. It makes you wonder whether a philosopher's profound insight can sometimes create more problems than it solves, leading to centuries of intellectual wrestling. As your mind slowly disengages from the frosty intellect of Descartes, you are left with the image of a man driven by an almost desperate need for certainty, a relentless seeker of truth who found solace in intellectual freedom and self-imposed exile. His life was a testament to the power of methodical doubt, but also a poignant reminder of the personal sacrifices, the profound loneliness, and the ultimate fragility that can accompany such a groundbreaking intellectual journey. His struggle was not just against ignorance, but against the very uncertainties of existence, a battle he waged largely alone until the harsh realities of the world finally claimed him. As the biting cold of Descartes' final Swedish winter dissipates, your mental journey now guides you to a profoundly different, yet equally challenging, philosophical life, that of Baruch Spinoza. Living in the Dutch Golden Age, a time of immense intellectual ferment, but also simmering religious intolerance. Spinoza, a Sephardic Jew, dared to construct a radical system of thought that identified God with nature, earning him excommunication from his community and a life of quiet, solitary erudition. His misery wasn't born of external political ambition or physical frailty, but rather a profound intellectual and spiritual conviction that alienated him from nearly everyone he knew. Imagine yourself in 17th century Amsterdam, a bustling port city, a beacon of commercial prosperity and, ostensibly, religious tolerance. Yet, even here, dissent could be dangerous, especially for a Jew challenging traditional religious dogma. Spinoza was born in 1632 into a prominent family of Portuguese Jews who had fled the Inquisition. He received a traditional Jewish education, mastering Hebrew texts, the Talmud, and medieval Jewish philosophy. However, his brilliant, inquisitive mind soon began to question the anthropomorphic God of Scripture and the literal interpretations of religious texts. You can almost feel the intellectual tension building, the quiet unease as a young man's rigorous logic begins to chip away at the unquestioned certainties of his upbringing. It's a terrifying moment when the foundations of your entire world begin to crack. His independent thinking quickly brought him into conflict with the leaders of the Jewish community. He was accused of holding abominable heresies, and for horrible heresies and monstrous deeds. In 1656, at the young age of 23, Spinoza was issued a cherem, a formal writ of excommunication from the Jewish community. This was not merely a religious censure, it was a devastating social and economic blow. He was banned from all contact with other Jews, effectively cut off from his family, friends, and the very community that had nurtured him. Imagine being completely ostracized, declared anathema by everyone you've ever known, simply for thinking differently. You can almost hear the solemn pronouncements, the heavy silence that follows as the door to your past life slams shut. This was perhaps the profoundest misery of Spinoza's life, a forced isolation, a public shaming that cast him into a lifelong solitude. After his excommunication, Spinoza adopted the Latin name Baruch from the Hebrew Benedito, meaning blessed, and dedicated himself entirely to philosophy. He refused offers of academic positions, including a prestigious professorship at Heidelberg, because he feared it would compromise his intellectual freedom. To support himself, he learned the laborious and often dangerous craft of grinding optical lenses, a skill that earned him a meager but independent living. Imagine the contrast: a brilliant mind contemplating the nature of God and substance, spending his days meticulously grinding glass. inhaling fine dust that would eventually damage his lungs. This wasn't a choice for comfort, it was a choice for intellectual integrity at the cost of material well-being and, as it turned out, his health. You can almost see the tiny particles floating in the air, the constant rubbing of glass, the quiet, persistent cough. His major work, the Ethics, demonstrated in geometrical order, was so controversial that he dared not publish it during his lifetime. In this masterpiece, he presented a unified, deterministic system where God is identical with nature, often termed pantheism or panentheism, and all things unfold according to necessary laws. He denied free will in the traditional sense and argued that true freedom lay in understanding and accepting the determined nature of reality. These ideas were considered dangerously atheistic by many Christians and Jews alike, threatening the very basis of organized religion and individual moral responsibility. The constant fear of persecution, the knowledge that his profoundest thoughts could lead to imprisonment or worse, was a heavy, persistent burden. You're holding a revolutionary truth in your hands, but you know uttering it too loudly could mean your demise. Spinoza's life was also marked by chronic illness, likely tuberculosis or silicosis from the glass dust, which slowly debilitated him. The constant physical discomfort, combined with his intellectual isolation and financial precariousness, paints a picture of a life lived on the fringes, sustained by sheer intellectual drive. He lived simply, had few possessions, and relied on a small circle of loyal friends who recognized his genius and provided occasional support. His solitude was a double-edged sword. It provided the quiet necessary for his profound work, but also denied him the warmth of sustained human connection. Save for a chosen few, his philosophical approach, demanding rigorous logical deduction akin to Euclidean geometry, made his work incredibly dense and challenging. He wasn't trying to charm or persuade, he was trying to prove. This uncompromising intellectual honesty, while admirable, also limited his audience and deepened his isolation from the broader intellectual currents of his time. He was a philosopher for the few, for those brave enough to follow his intricate arguments wherever they might lead. Even if it meant abandoning comforting illusions, the fear of persecution was not unfounded. Religious authorities in Holland periodically censored and condemned his writings. After his death, his Ethics and other works were placed on the Catholic Church's Index Librorum Prohibitorum Index of Forbidden Books, and his ideas continue to be denounced for centuries as blasphemous and dangerous. This post-mortem condemnation meant his misery extended beyond his lifetime, as his intellectual legacy remained mired in controversy. Even in death, his ideas were not at peace. Spinoza died in 1677 at the age of 44, his fragile body finally succumbing to his illness. His passing was quiet, almost unnoticed by the wider world. He left behind a handful of loyal friends and a body of work that, once discovered and understood, would profoundly influence subsequent philosophy, but only after decades, even centuries, of being reviled. His life was a testament to the idea that intellectual integrity, pursued uncompromisingly, can lead to deep personal suffering, even if it ultimately lays the groundwork for future enlightenment. A general historical fact about Spinoza is his radical monism, the belief that there is only one substance, which he called God or nature. This challenged both the traditional dualism of mind and matter like Descartes and the anthropomorphic conception of God, making him a truly revolutionary figure in Western thought. His system was a grand attempt to understand reality as a unified, coherent whole, where everything is interconnected and determined by natural laws. You can almost see the vast, intricate web of connections he envisioned, where every leaf, every thought, every star is part of the same divine substance. A fascinating, lesser-known detail about Spinoza is his remarkable ability to maintain a calm and composed demeanor, even amidst intense philosophical debate and personal adversity. Contemporaries described him as gentle, temperate, and exceedingly modest. he famously lived on a diet of gruel and beer, choosing a life of extreme austerity. This stoic detachment, while perhaps a coping mechanism for his intense isolation and physical suffering, was also deeply reflective of his philosophy to achieve freedom and tranquility by understanding and accepting the necessary order of the universe, rather than being swayed by external events or fleeting emotions. It makes you wonder how much of his philosophy was a product of his circumstances, and how much his circumstances were shaped by his philosophy. Did he find peace because he embraced austerity? Or did he embrace austerity because he was already at peace? The academic debate surrounding Spinoza's philosophy often centers on whether his system is truly deterministic, in a way that eliminates human freedom and moral responsibility, or if his concept of freedom as understanding necessity offers a different, but still meaningful, form of liberation. Some historians and philosophers argue that Spinoza's rigorous determinism, where all events are necessarily caused by prior events and ultimately by God nature, leaves no room for genuine human choice or accountability, leading to a cold, immoral universe. They see his philosophy as a profound challenge to traditional ethics and the very idea of individual agency, a source of intellectual discomfort for those who value free will. Conversely, other scholars contend that Spinoza's concept of freedom is profoundly liberating, arguing that by understanding the necessity of things, one can overcome the bondage of passions and false beliefs, leading to a deeper and more rational form of self-control and serenity. They suggest that his philosophy, far from being bleak, offers a pathway to a richer, more tranquil life through intellectual understanding. It's a debate that continues to reverberate through discussions of free will, morality, and the human place in a determined cosmos. As the quiet hum of the lens grinder fades into the stillness of the night, you are left with the austere yet profoundly inspiring image of Baruch Spinoza. His life was a testament to the bitter cost of intellectual independence, a life of profound solitude and physical suffering, born out of an uncompromising commitment to truth. He was a man excommunicated by his community, reviled by religious authorities, and largely unknown in his own time. Yet, it was precisely through this forced isolation and relentless pursuit of an unpopular truth that he forged a philosophical system of astonishing coherence and power, a system that, centuries later, would be recognized as a cornerstone of modern thought, proving that even the deepest misery can be the fertile ground for enduring genius. As the profound, solitary echoes of Spinoza's monism fade into the quiet, analytical spaces of your mind, you are now transported to the intellectual ferment of 18th century Scotland to encounter David Hume, often considered one of the most important figures in the history of Western philosophy and a central figure of the Scottish Enlightenment. Hume's work rigorously applied empiricism to its logical conclusions, leading him to radical skepticism about causality, personal identity, and even the existence of God. Yet, this pursuit of logical rigor brought him not widespread acclaim and comfort, but profound intellectual frustration, social misunderstanding, and a persistent, often melancholic sense of unappreciated genius. Imagine yourself in Edinburgh, a city alive with intellectual debate, where the air hums with the spirit of reason and inquiry. Hume was born here in 1711 into a family of modest means. From a young age, he displayed an extraordinary intellectual curiosity, but also a delicate constitution. He famously described experiencing a disease of the learned, a nervous breakdown in his early 20s, brought on by intense study and intellectual overexertion. You can almost feel the mental strain, the dizzying exhaustion of a mind pushing itself to its absolute limits, grappling with questions that seem to have no easy answers. It's the kind of intellectual misery that drains you of all energy, leaving you restless and unwell. His masterpiece, A Treatise of Human Nature, published in 1739-1740 when he was just 28, was a monumental attempt to apply the scientific method to the study of human nature itself. In it, he argued that all our knowledge comes from experience and impressions, leading him to doubt the rational basis for concepts like cause and effect, induction, and even a continuous self. He famously stated that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions. This was a truly revolutionary work, but one that met with a crushing silence upon its publication. Hume himself famously lamented that the treatise fell dead-born from the press, without reaching such distinction as even to excite a murmur among the zealots. Imagine dedicating years of your life, pouring your intellect into a work you believed would revolutionize thought, only for it to be utterly ignored. You'd probably feel a profound sense of disappointment, a deep frustration at the world's indifference. This lack of immediate recognition was a persistent source of misery for him. Hume's skepticism extended to religious belief, leading him to question miracles and the traditional arguments for God's existence. These views, though often expressed with caution and in later, less direct publications like Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion published posthumously, made him a controversial figure. He was twice denied professorships at Scottish universities, first at the University of Edinburgh and later at the University of Glasgow, primarily due to accusations of atheism and heresy. Imagine being exceptionally qualified, a brilliant scholar, but repeatedly denied the very positions that would allow you to pursue your passion and earn a stable living, all because your ideas were too radical for the establishment. You'd feel the sting of professional rejection, the bitterness of lost opportunities, the constant frustration of being misunderstood. His life was therefore marked by financial precarity for many years. He worked as a tutor, a secretary, and even a librarian at the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh, a position that, while granting him access to books, paid very little. He also attempted a career as a diplomat and briefly served as an aide-de-camp to a general. These were not the stable, dignified positions one might expect for a philosopher of his caliber. He was constantly struggling to make ends meet, to secure a comfortable living that would allow him to focus solely on his philosophical pursuits. This practical struggle, the nagging worry about money and status, was a persistent, underlying current of discomfort throughout his earlier life. It's hard to ponder the nature of reality when you're worried about paying the rent. Despite his profound intellectual insights, Hume cultivated a public persona of geniality and wit, often enjoying the company of friends and engaging in lively conversation. He was known for his plump, amiable appearance and his cheerful disposition in social settings, which somewhat belied the radical and often unsettling nature of his philosophical conclusions. This contrast between his public demeanor and his deeply skeptical, even melancholic, inner world hints at a certain performative aspect to his life, a need to present a comforting facade to a world that was often hostile to his true thoughts. You're the life of the party, but secretly, you're questioning the very reality of the party and your own existence within it. One of Hume's most famous and perhaps most frustrating intellectual struggles was his challenge to the concept of causality. He argued that we never actually observe a necessary connection between cause and effect, only a constant conjunction of events. Our belief in causality, he contended, is merely a habit of mind, a psychological expectation based on past experience, not a logical necessity. This revolutionary idea shattered centuries of philosophical certainty and, for him, demonstrated the limits of human reason. Imagine meticulously dismantling a concept that everyone takes for granted, only to find that most people simply don't grasp the profundity or the implications of your discovery. It's an intellectual loneliness, a sense of being ahead of your time, and therefore deeply unappreciated. His later years brought him more recognition and financial stability through his multi-volume History of England, which became a bestseller and finally provided him with the financial independence he craved. However, even this success was bittersweet, as he viewed himself primarily as a philosopher, and the history was, in a sense, a more popular, less intellectually rigorous undertaking for him. He found a wider audience, but perhaps at the cost of the deeper intellectual engagement he desired. Hume's friendship with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, another great Enlightenment figure, also ended in a spectacular and public falling out, causing Hume considerable distress. Rousseau, increasingly paranoid, accused Hume of plotting against him, leading to a bitter exchange of letters that became public. This personal betrayal, this public accusation of treachery from a fellow intellectual, must have been profoundly painful. You're a rationalist, but even you can't escape the irrationality and cruelty of human relationships. It highlights the deeply personal nature of intellectual life, where even friendships could be fraught with intense emotional turmoil. A general historical fact about Hume is his pivotal role in developing empiricism and challenging the rationalist tradition that preceded him. He pushed the idea that all knowledge originates from sensory experience and impressions to its radical conclusion. Influencing later philosophers like Immanuel Kant, who famously said, "Hume awakened me from my dogmatic slumber," and shaping the course of analytic philosophy. His relentless skepticism forced philosophy to confront the limits of human reason and the foundations of knowledge in a way no one had before. A curious, lesser-known detail about Hume's life is his incredibly calm and cheerful demeanor in the face of death. Diagnosed with a fatal intestinal disorder, he famously maintained his wit, equanimity, and even a sense of humor, reportedly chatting cheerfully with friends and playing whist until shortly before his passing in 1776. Adam Smith, his close friend, described his last days as perfectly easy and, what is more, perfectly cheerful. This stoic acceptance of his own mortality, even when faced with a painful illness, is remarkable, especially for a man whose philosophy questioned so much about human nature and the afterlife. It raises the intriguing question of how a radical skeptic, who denied the rational basis for an afterlife, could face death with such serene contentment. Was it a testament to his philosophical conclusions, or simply a profound personal resilience? The academic debate surrounding Hume often focuses on the implications of his skepticism, whether it ultimately leads to an untenable nihilism, or whether it provides a necessary cautionary foundation for genuine inquiry. Some historians and philosophers argue that Hume's relentless skepticism, by undermining belief in causation, induction, and even personal identity, leads to a philosophical dead end, making knowledge and moral judgment impossible. They see his conclusions as deeply unsettling and potentially destructive to the very project of philosophy, a source of profound intellectual discomfort. Conversely, other scholars contend that Hume's skepticism was a vital and necessary corrective. Clearing away unfounded metaphysical claims and forcing philosophy to build knowledge on more solid empirical ground, they view his work as a liberating force that exposed the limits of human reason, paving the way for more rigorous scientific and philosophical inquiry, a source of clarity rather than despair. It's a debate that continues to shape discussions about the limits of knowledge and the very nature of truth. As your mind gently pulls away from the intellectual currents of the Scottish Enlightenment, you are left with the compelling, slightly paradoxical image of David Hume. He was a philosopher who rigorously dismantled the very foundations of human certainty, yet maintained a cheerful public demeanor. His life was a testament to the bitter taste of unappreciated genius, the frustration of profound insights falling on deaf ears, and the persistent challenge of living a life of radical skepticism in a world built on unquestioned beliefs. Yet, it was precisely through these intellectual struggles and personal disappointments that he forged a philosophy that would forever reshape the landscape of Western thought, reminding us that sometimes the most profound wisdom is found in the courage to doubt everything. As the profound skepticism of David Hume settles into the background of your thoughts, you are now transported to the meticulously ordered, yet intellectually rigorous world of 18th century Königsberg, Prussia, modern-day Kaliningrad, Russia, to encounter Immanuel Kant. Often considered one of the most influential thinkers in the history of Western philosophy, Kant embarked on a monumental project to reconcile the warring factions of rationalism and empiricism, aiming to establish the true limits and possibilities of human knowledge and morality. Yet, this life dedicated to abstract thought was paradoxically marked by profound personal isolation, rigid routine, and an almost obsessive fear of physical and mental decline. Imagine yourself in the quiet, provincial town of Königsberg, a Baltic port city where Kant lived his entire life, never venturing more than 100 miles from his birthplace. He was born in 1724 into a modest, devout pietist family, a Protestant movement emphasizing personal piety and religious experience over formal doctrine. This upbringing instilled in him a deep moral earnestness and a strong sense of duty, qualities that would permeate his philosophical work. You can almost feel the chill of the Baltic air, the quiet rhythm of a life largely untouched by the wider world's commotions. Kant was a small, frail man, plagued by various ailments throughout his life, including a curved spine and a hypochondriacal disposition. He famously devised a strict, almost ritualistic daily routine to compensate for his weak constitution and ensure maximum intellectual productivity. He would wake precisely at 5:00 a.m., drink a cup of weak tea, and meditate for an hour. Then he would prepare his lectures, deliver them, eat a single meal at 1 p.m., always with company, as he believed conversation aided digestion, take a precisely timed philosopher's walk, and then spend the evening reading and writing. This rigid adherence to routine, while contributing to his longevity and prolific output, also speaks to a profound underlying anxiety about maintaining control over his fragile body and restless mind. You can almost hear the ticking clock, the meticulous counting of steps, as he tries to impose order on the chaos of physical existence. It's a misery born of constant self-regulation, a battle against the body's inherent unpredictability. Despite his immense intellectual output, Kant lived a remarkably solitary personal life. He never married and had no known romantic relationships. His social interactions were largely confined to his daily dinner companions and academic colleagues. While some might view this as a choice for intellectual purity, it also suggests a deep-seated personal isolation, a profound lack of intimate human connection. Imagine spending your life grappling with the deepest questions of existence, yet doing so largely alone, without the warmth and comfort of a family or a partner. This personal void, this emotional austerity, could be a significant, if quiet, source of misery. His philosophical project, particularly his 3 critiques, Critique of Pure Reason, 1781, Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, and Critique of Judgment, 1790, were incredibly ambitious and demanded immense intellectual effort. Critique of Pure Reason, his first great work, famously awakened him from his dogmatic slumber, referencing Hume's skepticism by arguing that while all knowledge begins with experience, it does not arise entirely from experience. Instead, the human mind actively structures experience through innate categories of understanding like causality, unity, substance. This was a revolutionary insight, but it was also incredibly difficult to articulate, taking him years of intense, solitary labor. The sheer mental strain of constructing such a complex philosophical system, often leading to moments of profound frustration and self-doubt, must have been immense. You're trying to build a bridge between 2 intellectual continents, and every stone must be meticulously placed. The reception of his Critique of Pure Reason was initially slow and often misunderstood. Its dense, abstract prose and revolutionary ideas made it difficult for his contemporaries to grasp. Imagine pouring decades of thought into a work you believe will redefine philosophy, only for it to be met with confusion, misinterpretation, or even outright dismissal. This intellectual isolation, this feeling of being ahead of your time and therefore uncomprehended, could be a profound source of professional misery. You're speaking a language no one else quite understands. Moreover, Kant faced challenges from both ends of the intellectual spectrum. His philosophy was seen by some religious authorities as dangerous, as it limited the scope of theoretical reason to make room for faith, effectively removing God from the realm of empirical proof. At the same time, Enlightenment rationalists criticized him for limiting the power of pure reason. This meant he was constantly walking a tightrope, trying to defend his nuanced position against accusations from all sides. The intellectual battle, the constant need to clarify and defend, could be emotionally draining. You're trying to build a new path, but everyone is throwing rocks at you from the old ones. In his later years, Kant also faced direct censorship from the Prussian government. In 1792, his work, Religion Within the Bounds of Bare Reason, published 1793, which offered a rational interpretation of religion, drew the ire of King Frederick William II, who was concerned about the spread of Enlightenment ideas that challenged traditional religious authority. Kant was admonished by royal decree and forbidden from lecturing or writing further on religious subjects. Imagine dedicating your life to the pursuit of truth, only to be silenced by political authority. This intellectual suppression, this forced silence, must have been a deeply painful and humiliating experience for a man whose life was synonymous with free inquiry. You're told to stop thinking, to stop writing, simply because your thoughts are inconvenient to those in power. The slow decline of old age also brought its own miseries to Kant. Despite his rigorous routine, his health eventually deteriorated. His memory began to fail, and his intellectual powers, once so sharp, gradually waned. This decline, for a man whose entire identity was built upon the power of his mind, must have been particularly agonizing. Imagine watching your own intellect, the very core of your being, slowly slip away, knowing that the engine of your life is sputtering. This quiet, internal struggle against his own failing capacities was perhaps one of his profoundest personal miseries. A key historical fact about Kant is his development of transcendental idealism, arguing that our knowledge of reality is not merely a passive reception of sensory data, but is actively shaped by the innate structures of our mind. He also famously formulated the categorical imperative in ethics, stating that moral duties are universal and unconditional, guiding actions that could be applied as universal laws. These contributions profoundly reshaped metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, making him a pivotal figure who synthesized and transcended earlier philosophical traditions. You can almost feel the click of the mental gears as he constructed a system where human reason wasn't just a mirror reflecting reality, but an active sculptor of it. A peculiar, lesser-known detail about Kant is his meticulous attention to meteorological phenomena and his deep interest in geography. Even though he never traveled, he owned a vast collection of maps and was known to spend hours studying them. He lectured on physical geography for 24 years, attracting large audiences, which was unusual for a philosophy professor. This fascination with the world he never saw firsthand suggests a compensatory mechanism for his extreme lack of travel and personal experience beyond Königsberg. It paints a picture of a mind that, while rigorously confined by circumstance, longed to comprehend the vastness of the external world, meticulously piecing it together from books and maps. It makes you wonder about the internal world of a man who traveled the cosmos in his mind, but never left his hometown. The academic debate concerning Kant's philosophy is vast, but one central point of contention revolves around the practicality and applicability of his categorical imperative in real-world moral dilemmas. Some ethicists and historians argue that while the categorical imperative provides a powerful and logically coherent framework for universal morality, its strict universality can lead to rigid, unbending moral rules that fail to account for the complexities and nuances of real-life situations, leading to practical moral misery. They question whether it genuinely helps in cases where duties conflict, or where consequences seem to matter more than pure adherence to universal law. Conversely, other scholars defend Kant, arguing that the strength of the categorical imperative lies precisely in its insistence on universalizability and respect for persons, providing an indispensable foundation for justice and human rights, even if its application requires careful thought. They contend that any moral system will face complex dilemmas, and Kant provides a rigorous framework for navigating them, offering a form of ethical clarity rather than confusion. It's a debate that forces you to ponder how ideal principles meet messy reality, and whether a philosophy of perfect duty can truly guide imperfect human beings. As your mind slowly detaches from the meticulous, yet profoundly solitary, world of Königsberg, you are left with the compelling image of Immanuel Kant. His life was a testament to the power of a disciplined mind, but also a poignant reminder of the personal costs of intellectual ambition, the gnawing anxieties of a frail body, and the quiet misery of profound isolation. He sought to bring order to the chaos of human experience and morality. Yet his own life was a battle against the very forces of disorder that ultimately claimed his sharp intellect. His rigorous pursuit of universal truth, however, cemented his place as a foundational figure, proving that even the most confined life can produce boundless intellectual frontiers. As the meticulous routines and profound insights of Immanuel Kant recede into the quiet, analytical chambers of your mind, you are now violently propelled into the turbulent and often harrowing intellectual landscape of 19th century Germany to encounter Friedrich Nietzsche, a philosopher who declared God is dead and championed the Übermensch. Nietzsche's life was a dramatic saga of intellectual brilliance, profound suffering, and eventual descent into madness. His misery was not merely external circumstance, but an internal crucible, forging a philosophy of immense power and devastating personal cost. Imagine yourself in Rücken, a small German village where Nietzsche was born in 1844. His early life was marked by tragedy. His father, a Lutheran pastor, died when Nietzsche was just 5, followed shortly by the death of his younger brother. He grew up in a household dominated by women. His mother, grandmother, 2 aunts, and younger sister. An environment that some scholars argue contributed to his later complex views on gender and masculinity. You can almost feel the stifling atmosphere of grief, the absence of a strong paternal figure, shaping a sensitive, brilliant child. This early exposure to death and loss undoubtedly cultivated a profound awareness of human fragility and the arbitrary nature of suffering, themes that would later become central to his philosophy. Nietzsche was a prodigy, excelling in classical philology, the study of ancient languages and texts. At the remarkably young age of 24, before even completing his doctorate, he was appointed professor of classical philology at the University of Basel, Switzerland. This was an unprecedented achievement, suggesting a mind of extraordinary power. However, this early brilliance was quickly overshadowed by physical torment. From his youth, Nietzsche suffered from a constellation of debilitating health problems, extreme nearsightedness, chronic headaches, debilitating stomach ailments, and bouts of nausea and vomiting. These conditions grew worse throughout his adult life, often leaving him in agonizing pain and severely limiting his ability to work. Imagine trying to write groundbreaking philosophical treatises while battling constant, searing pain behind your eyes, or the persistent churning of an upset stomach. You're trying to unravel the deepest mysteries of existence, but your body is in constant rebellion. This relentless physical misery was a constant companion, a heavy anchor dragging at his soaring intellect. He would often have to spend days in darkened rooms, unable to read or write, enduring waves of nausea. This wasn't just discomfort, it was a physical torture that consumed much of his limited energy. His academic career was cut short due to his deteriorating health. He resigned from his professorship in 1879 at the age of 34 and became a wanderer, seeking climates that might alleviate his suffering. He spent years moving between various boarding houses in Switzerland, Italy, and France, often living in isolation. This nomadic existence, driven by the desperate hope of finding relief from his pain, meant a life largely devoid of stability, comfort, or a permanent home. He was a philosopher without a fixed address, constantly searching for a place where his body would allow his mind to flourish. You can almost feel the chill of an unfamiliar room, the loneliness of unpacking yet again, always chasing a fleeting moment of physical peace. Nietzsche's philosophy was profoundly radical and iconoclastic. He challenged conventional morality, especially Christian morality, questioned the very concept of objective truth, and argued for a revaluation of all values. His concept of the will to power as the fundamental driving force in life, and the idea of the Übermensch Overman, a higher type of human who creates his own values, were revolutionary but also deeply unsettling. His declaration that God is dead was not a celebratory statement of atheism, but a lament for the loss of a foundational moral framework, which he believed would lead to a period of nihilism and crisis for Western civilization. Imagine articulating such profound, unsettling truths, knowing they would be misunderstood, reviled, or simply too overwhelming for most people to grasp. This intellectual isolation, this sense of speaking a truth that few could bear, was a profound source of misery. His relationships were often strained and disappointing. His intense friendship with the composer Richard Wagner eventually soured, leading to a bitter public feud. Nietzsche had initially idolized Wagner, seeing him as a cultural redeemer, but later became disillusioned with Wagner's growing anti-Semitism and his embrace of Christian themes in his later works. This rupture with a man he deeply admired, a man who had been a significant intellectual and emotional anchor, must have been profoundly painful. A devastating personal betrayal. You poured your soul into a friendship, only to see it crumble into animosity and public recrimination. His few attempts at romantic relationships also ended in failure, notably with the intellectual Lou Andreas Salome, who rejected his marriage proposal. This consistent lack of intimate connection, whether due to his own personality, his demanding intellectual pursuits, or simply unfortunate circumstances, contributed to a profound sense of loneliness. He was a man who wrote extensively about love and human relationships, yet seemingly struggled to find lasting personal affection in his own life. The echoes of unfulfilled longing, the quiet ache of being alone, must have resonated deeply within him. The culmination of Nietzsche's misery was his complete mental breakdown in January 1889. While in Turin, Italy, he witnessed a horse being flogged in the street, embraced the animal, and then collapsed into a state of severe mental illness from which he never recovered. The precise cause of his madness is debated by scholars, with theories ranging from syphilis, a common diagnosis at the time, to a brain tumor, or a rare form of inherited dementia. Regardless of the physical cause, the psychological toll of his constant pain, isolation, and intense intellectual exertion undoubtedly contributed to his fragile mental state. Imagine being one of the most brilliant minds of your time, and then having your own mind turn against you, plunging you into a darkness from which there is no return. This descent into madness was the ultimate tragic misery of his life. For the last 11 years of his life, until his death in 1900, Nietzsche was cared for by his mother, and then his sister. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, who unfortunately exploited his work for her own anti-Semitic and nationalist agendas, posthumously twisting his philosophy to fit her own prejudices. This post-mortem distortion of his ideas by his own family member adds another layer of tragic misery to his legacy. A final betrayal of his intellectual integrity. He could no longer defend his thoughts, and they were twisted into something he would have abhorred. A key historical fact about Nietzsche is his profound influence on 20th century philosophy, psychology, and literature, particularly existentialism, postmodernism, and psychoanalysis. His radical challenge to traditional values, his focus on power, and his psychological insights into human motivation opened up entirely new avenues of thought. He forced subsequent thinkers to confront uncomfortable truths about morality, meaning, and the human condition. You can see the ripples of his thought in nearly every major intellectual movement that followed him, a testament to the seismic shift he created. A peculiar, lesser-known detail about Nietzsche is his deep love for music, particularly the works of Bizet and, initially, Wagner. He composed several pieces himself, though they were not widely acclaimed. His appreciation for music was not just aesthetic. He saw it as a profound expression of the Dionysian, life-affirming force, in contrast to the Apollonian principle of order and reason. This artistic sensibility, this deep connection to the non-rational, adds a fascinating dimension to a philosopher often perceived as purely intellectual and austere. It suggests a man who sought solace and meaning not only in rigorous thought, but also in the raw, emotional power of art, a fleeting escape from his constant suffering. The academic debate concerning Nietzsche is perhaps one of the most intense and contentious in philosophy, largely due to the varying interpretations and occasional misinterpretations of his work, particularly in relation to Nazism. Some historians and philosophers strongly emphasize the problematic aspects of his thought, such as his concept of the will to power and his critiques of traditional morality, arguing that these elements, and when taken out of context or selectively interpreted as they were by his sister and later by the Nazis, can be seen as providing philosophical justification for authoritarianism, violence, and even anti-Semitism, leading to profound moral and political misery. They stress the dangers of an anything-goes morality and the potential for his ideas to be twisted to nefarious ends. Conversely, other scholars argue that a careful reading of Nietzsche reveals a nuanced and complex thinker whose primary concern was individual self-overcoming and the creation of new values in a secular age, and that his work should be understood as a profound critique of nihilism, not an endorsement of it. They contend that he was strongly anti-nationalist and anti-Semitic in his later life, and that linking him directly to Nazism is a gross misinterpretation of his actual philosophy, a source of intellectual anguish for those who seek to redeem his legacy. It's a debate that forces you to confront the immense power and responsibility of ideas, and how even the most brilliant thoughts can be distorted with devastating consequences. As your mind slowly retreats from the tortured genius of Friedrich Nietzsche, you are left with the indelible image of a man whose profound insights were forged in the crucible of unimaginable personal suffering. His life was a testament to the relentless pursuit of truth, however uncomfortable, however unsettling, and the ultimate tragic cost of such an uncompromising intellectual journey. He explored the deepest abysses of the human spirit, only to be consumed by his own inner demons and the physical torment that haunted him. Yet, his ideas, even in their controversy, continue to resonate, reminding us that sometimes the most profound philosophy emerges from the deepest wells of human misery, as the harrowing echoes of Nietzsche's final tragic descent into madness subside. Your quiet journey through the lives of suffering philosophers reaches its final reflective chapter. We've traversed centuries, from ancient Greece to the dawn of the 20th century, witnessing brilliant minds grappling not only with the deepest questions of existence, but also with profound personal hardships, societal rejection, and the relentless torment of their own bodies and minds. This final segment isn't about one philosopher, but about the philosophical echoes, the lasting impact of their misery, the surprising ways their suffering shaped their ideas, and how their often unhappy lives continue to resonate with us today, even as the world around us bustles on. Oblivious to the silent battles once waged, imagine, for a moment, the common thread weaving through these disparate lives. From Socrates' hemlock to Spinoza's excommunication, from Plato's failed political dreams to Hume's neglected masterpiece, from Descartes' lonely pursuit of certainty to Kant's meticulous solitude, and finally to Nietzsche's agonizing physical and mental collapse. Each story is a testament to the fact that the path of profound intellectual inquiry is rarely one of unadulterated comfort. These were not armchair theorists detached from reality. They were deeply human beings, often wrestling with very real and very painful struggles that, in many ways, fueled their philosophical fire. You can almost feel the raw emotion, the desperate urgency in their pursuit of meaning amidst their own pain. A silent scream of the soul turned into intricate thought. Consider how their struggles made their philosophies more authentic, more grounded in the human condition. They weren't just speculating in abstract terms. They were often living out the very problems they were trying to solve. Their bodies and spirits bearing the brunt of their intellectual daring. Socrates, confronting mortality, forced Athens to confront its own values, making his trial a living embodiment of ethical conflict. Plato, disillusioned by political corruption after witnessing the 30 tyrants and Socrates' execution, didn't just write about an ideal state, he felt the visceral need for it, a profound longing for a world where justice might truly reign. Spinoza, ostracized for his beliefs, found solace and intellectual liberation in constructing a system of radical freedom achieved through understanding necessity, a personal triumph over collective rejection. Hume, battling ill health and the crushing silence surrounding his early work, pushed empiricism to its limits, questioning the very fabric of cause and effect, driven by a relentless need to ground knowledge in tangible experience. Kant, confined by his own frailties and the intellectual battles of his time, sought to impose order on the chaos of human experience. Devising universal moral laws that could stand firm against the shifting sands of opinion, a desperate attempt to create certainty where none seemed to exist. And Nietzsche, wrestling with chronic pain and mental instability, explored the depths of suffering and nihilism not from a distance, but from within the abyss, seeking to find pathways to human flourishing and self-overcoming. Their personal crucible often became the forge for their grandest philosophical insights. Imbued with a gravitas that only lived experience can provide, you realize that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from those who have walked through the darkest valleys, emerging scarred but enlightened. Yet, this isn't to romanticize suffering. No one would choose the agonizing, brain-racking pain of Nietzsche or the public humiliation and slow death of Socrates. Their misery was real, often debilitating, and undoubtedly limited what they could achieve in some ways, truncating careers, preventing collaborations, or perhaps even stifling ideas that never saw the light of day. They faced rejection, poverty, chronic illness, and profound isolation, not as noble choices, but as grim, unavoidable realities. The world, in its often blind adherence to tradition and its fear of radical thought, was frequently unkind to those who dared to think differently, to challenge established norms, or to pursue knowledge for its own sake rather than for power or immediate wealth. You can almost hear the sighs of exasperation, the quiet despair of brilliant minds encountering a world too slow, too rigid, or too afraid to understand them. A world that preferred comforting lies to uncomfortable truths. This constant friction between their expansive intellects and the narrow confines of their lived circumstances was a source of perpetual, grinding discomfort. The historical impact of their miserable lives is immense and undeniable. The very fact that they persevered, often against overwhelming odds, to produce such enduring works speaks volumes about the human spirit's capacity for resilience and intellectual dedication. Their stories serve as powerful reminders of the courage required to pursue truth, especially when that truth is uncomfortable or unpopular, threatening the very foundations of society or personal belief. They show us that profound thought rarely emerges from a place of passive contentment. It often demands sacrifice, struggle, and an unwavering commitment to inquiry. Even when the personal cost is immense and the immediate reward is non-existent, they carved paths through intellectual wildernesses, often bleeding along the way, so that others could follow with greater ease. Think about how often you take for granted the very concepts these philosophers fought to articulate justice: knowledge, identity, morality, freedom, and the nature of reality. Each of these ideas, so fundamental to our modern understanding, was hammered out in the crucible of their personal struggles, their very pain shaping the contours of their thought. The truths we now debate in classrooms and cafes were once revolutionary, dangerous, and often deeply unsettling to the societies in which they emerged. You realize that your own intellectual comfort today, your freedom to explore these concepts without fear of hemlock or excommunication, stands on the shoulders of giants who knew little comfort themselves, who often paid the ultimate price for their intellectual audacity. Their personal sacrifices paved the way for the intellectual freedoms we often take for granted. The legacy of these philosophers also includes the enduring debates their ideas sparked. Debates that continue to rage in philosophical circles even today. Their lives of misery often ignited centuries of intellectual misery for those who followed. As scholars wrestled with the profound questions they left unanswered or the challenging paradoxes they unveiled. From the intractable mind-body problem spawned by Descartes' dualism to the unsettling implications of Hume's skepticism about causality and induction, or the rigorous ethical demands of Kant's categorical imperative, their struggles continue to fuel philosophical inquiry today. The academic discomfort they experienced in their lives became the intellectual discomfort that drives philosophical progress for generations, forcing successive thinkers to push boundaries, refine arguments, and seek ever deeper understanding. You find yourself drawn into these debates, seeing the echoes of their personal battles in the ongoing intellectual wrestling matches of contemporary philosophy. It's a fascinating, sometimes frustrating, inheritance, even today, in our seemingly more enlightened times. The challenges these philosophers faced resonate with a surprising contemporary relevance. The fear of censorship, the struggle for intellectual freedom in an age of cancel culture and misinformation, the relentless battle against ignorance and dogma, the unending search for meaning in a complex, often bewildering world, the anxieties of health and mortality that plague us all. These are universal human experiences that transcend time and culture. These philosophers, through their own suffering, provide us with frameworks, cautionary tales, and inspiring examples of how to confront these perennial challenges with courage, integrity, and intellectual rigor. They teach us that true freedom often lies in the mastery of one's own mind, and that the greatest victories are sometimes internal ones. You realize that the very act of thinking deeply, of questioning the world around you, still carries a cost. Perhaps not the bitter taste of hemlock, but certainly intellectual and emotional strain, a quiet courage that few truly possess. The enduring power of their stories lies not just in their ideas, but in the profound human drama behind them. They remind us that philosophy is not a sterile, disembodied pursuit, but a vibrant, often painful, human endeavor. They were flesh and blood individuals who felt pain, joy, loneliness, and despair, just like us. It is this very humanity, coupled with their extraordinary intellect, that makes their legacy so compelling and their contributions so timeless. Their misery, ironically, made them more relatable, more profoundly human, and therefore their wisdom more impactful. They show us that even from the depths of personal anguish, the brightest intellectual lights can emerge, illuminating paths for generations yet unborn. In the quiet depths of their often miserable lives, these philosophers found the raw material for their greatest insights. Their suffering wasn't in vain. It was, paradoxically, part of their lasting gift to humanity. It was the crucible in which their ideas were forged, turning the lead of personal pain into the gold of enduring wisdom. And as you drift into slumber, perhaps you'll carry a piece of that wisdom with you, a deeper understanding of the human spirit's capacity for both suffering and profound thought.